Have you ever come out of the interview room and felt like, why didn't the judges ask me the main highlight question? They didn't ask me about my platform. They didn't ask me why I should be the next title holder. And you often feel like they ask other contestants better questions, whereas you get all these random questions that make no sense. If that's happened to you, or if you're about to compete in a pageant and this is your fear, then this episode is for you. Hi, you, and welcome back to the Conquer podcast. I'm your host, Nikita Dhanwani, and I'm so happy to see you here. And in today's episode, we're going to be talking about some pageant paperwork mistakes that can cost you the crown. And it's important that you make sure your paperwork is strategized and intentional and not just an application form that you filled out while thinking that, maybe I'm going to start the more serious part of my preparation afterwards. And for now, let's just apply to compete, but this doesn't really count. You could not be more wrong, because here's something that you need to know. Your pageant paperwork, when you apply that application form, registration form, the one that has questions about why are you applying and why does this title mean so much to you, and tell us about your interests and a little bit about yourself, that piece of paperwork is actually seen by your interview judges before you walk into the room. And that's where they decide what questions to ask you. So if your social media profile is like your digital interview and establishes your online presence, which then needs to make sense and align with who you are in person, similarly, your pageant paperwork is like your black and white interview. It's your first impression in front of the judges before you even introduce yourself, before they even check out your profile or they've ever seen your picture and headshot. From my experience as a pageant coach, having worked with hundreds of contestants, over the years, I've noticed some common paperwork mistakes that contestants tend to make. And so for today's episode, I've put together a list of 5 common mistakes that you should avoid while filling out your pageant paperwork. The first one is pretty simple, but also so easily neglected, which is proofreading. This includes typos, grammatical mistakes, and things that sometimes we simply do not see because we've gone through that form, that piece of paper, and we've read it like 500 times. And this has happened to me so often that I'll post like an Instagram story, and I know that I checked it like 5 times before posting, and still once it's gone and it's posted, and I hate the fact that we cannot edit our stories, and I'll see a typo. And it just never makes sense. Why didn't I see it beforehand? And it's the worst feeling when sometimes you scroll down your own social media and you see a typo somewhere. And yes, you can go fix those captions later, but your paperwork cannot be changed and edited. And also, even if you are allowed to make changes over a certain period of time, every single time you reach out to the organization, it just shows that she's not someone who does a good job at the very first time. And that's not the kind of opinion or impression you want to make in front of someone. So before you go ahead and submit your pageant paperwork, I highly recommend that you give it to a few more people around you. Have a fresh pair of eyes, have a look at it. And this could be your school or college teachers, professors who are really good at usually proofreading, elder siblings, family, friends, people that you perhaps had reached out to when you were submitting your SOPs, when you were applying for your master's or business programs. And these people have known you, know your life story, or people just who in general are helping people proofread their essays and articles. Give it to someone like that. And also ask them that if you didn't know that my name was written on this piece of paper, could you still identify that this is me? That's a really good way of checking whether or not your pageant paperwork has enough personality and reflects who you are, rather than just sound like a generic pageant contestant application form. The second kind of mistake that most pageant contestants make is giving an overdose of information in their pageant paperwork. And I get you. I hear you. I know you want them to know everything about you. But sometimes when certain questions appear on paperwork, such as tell us your accomplishments or what achievement are you most proud of, first of all, you do not want to necessarily write things like finding myself or finding inner peace and things like that, because they're looking for something more unique and something that they can ask you a question about. So whatever you're mentioning needs to be interesting enough and not something that they're just going to be like, yeah, I've heard that. Okay. And that has somehow become a pattern. And the second thing is, you don't want to list out all of your life achievements. Now, something that you did perhaps 10, 15 years ago, not really relevant to a recent accomplishment, which is what the paperwork is looking for. So you want to keep your achievements and accomplishments, any rewards that you've received, titles, to the last 4 to 5 years. That's a good time period. There is, however, a situation where you can make exceptions and also mention achievements and accomplishments older than 5 years. And that's when, if let's say you have a degree in psychology and you got that degree 8 or 10 years ago, and now you're competing in a pageant whose cause and platform is mainly centered around mental health. Now, because it is so connected and makes obvious sense to mention the fact that you have a degree in psychology, you would mention that there. So you have to look at, what does this pageant care about? What does it stand for? Always go to the pageant's website and read about the about section, the mission statement, and that will give you an idea of what kind of accomplishments you should actually be mentioning. And that's a good way of judging for yourself what is relevant, what is needed, what is irrelevant. You really don't want to write irrelevant information because that's just going to be confusing to the judges, and that's how you end up in a situation where they didn't really ask you the questions you had hoped for or wanted them to ask you because you didn't really structure your paperwork according to that. They're going to ask you based on what you wrote. It's kind of really similar to how you would update your resume or cover letter, right? When you apply for jobs, you don't actually end up sending the same resume or cover letter to every single job application. You always make some minor changes based on the skill set that that position wants, so that you have higher odds of making through the first round of filtering and so that you do get a chance to interview. The same approach is what you apply here for your pageant paperwork as well. And so your paperwork would not actually look the same. You can't just have like template answers, or like your paperwork done for one pageant will not necessarily be the same answers that you're going to give, say, next year if you apply and compete in another system. You want to change your paperwork. And now if you're a pageant contestant who's been competing for years now, and you're saying that, you know what, I think by this point, what I stand for, my introduction, my accomplishments, not a lot has been changing in the last few years, you still want to be able to find a way to update your information. The most off-putting thing, and I've seen and experienced this firsthand when a certain pageant organization was interviewing my coaching clients, and there was one particular contestant who was giving the exact same introduction that she had memorized and rehearsed the year before that. The organization called her out and they said, "We've heard you say this before, so tell me what's changed since last year." And that should tell you that even if you're a pageant veteran and more or less your paperwork is not going to drastically change, it's not going to be a whole 360-degree turn, but you still want to be able to change at least 10 to 15% of your paperwork, and also mention, like, since last year, this is what I've accomplished. The third kind of mistake I've seen contestants make is either they're being too mysterious on their paperwork. They don't want to tell too much because they want to keep the mystery in there, and they're hoping the judges are going to ask them questions because they didn't reveal everything. And sometimes being mysterious is not actually even intentional. It's actually just a mistake that they've made. And how you end up doing that is by using words or putting references, names of systems, of titles, of scholarships that the judges or most common people would not even be aware of. So you have to look at your paperwork and think, if someone who wasn't in the same industry as me, and if they weren't just familiar with some of the names that I've, name dropped, I have this scholarship, or I have this award, or I went to this university, and maybe you're mentioning it because it's a really big deal. But the fact is, not everybody knows that certain things are big deals. And so you have to tell them. And that's how you have to ensure that you're marketing yourself with specific details inside your paperwork. To give you an example, a recent client that I'm working with has been enrolled in a diploma for movement arts. Now, here's the thing. She recently had a spinal injury, not recently, in fact, that was like 5 years ago. And after her spinal injury, the fact that she is enrolled into a program for movement arts in itself is a really big deal. However, while I was working with her, I did a quick Google search of this scholarship that she had mentioned inside her introduction. And I just wanted to know more. And that's something that I do with a lot of my coaching clients, do a more thorough background research. Maybe there are facts about their own life that they wouldn't even have told me because they didn't think it was important enough. And when I did a quick Google search about this scholarship, turns out not too many people in the entire country have that scholarship. And in fact, it was a bigger program inside which, for movement arts, specifically in which my client was enrolled, that year, only 2 people in the entire country had received that scholarship. When I saw that on my screen, I was super impressed. But the next thing I did was call her up and ask her, why didn't you tell me that you're one of the 2 people in the country to have this scholarship? It happens way more often than you can imagine. And so many of us, and I've done that too, myself included, have somehow not realized that we're not marketing ourselves. We tend to undersell ourselves without even realizing it, which is why a fresh pair of eyes and sometimes working with a coach helps. Because then when we changed the story to having recovered from a spinal injury and 5 years later, now the sentence sounds different. Being one of the 2 women in the entire country to be enrolled in XYZ program, it just hits different. And at this point, we didn't even need to mention the name of the scholarship that she had. Because if we had done that, here's the thing. If I hadn't done that quick Google search, I wouldn't know too much about that scholarship either, just because I'm not a part of that industry. I'm not an artist in the dance industry or the movement arts. And a lot of judges might also have read that scholarship name, not know too much about it. And here's something that judges do. They are always sitting in a panel. Some judges are judging a pageant for the first time ever. And if they see something mentioned that they're not familiar with, they won't ask you about it, even though you were hoping that they would, because you know it's a big deal. The reason they didn't ask about it is because they don't know much about it and they don't want to sound silly or unaware by asking a question. So the judge, simple human behavior, is not going to ask questions about something that they don't know too much about, because they're scared about how it might lead to a conversation where they come across as someone who doesn't know enough. And you would do that too if you were a judge. And so that's why the judge never asked you that question. And so you want to mention your achievements, but in a way that in a parenthesis, like sometimes in a bracket next to it, even if she's mentioned the scholarship name, she can write one of 2 women in the entire country to receive this. Now, it's not the name, it's that importance that you've given. It's that statistic and detail that actually highlighted that specific achievement. Same thing with a university or anything else. Maybe the selection rate is 0.5%. You could write things like that inside the parentheses. And so that's a few tips on how you can market yourself better. And another thing that I've seen happen very often is that when there's a question about what are your interests, a lot of contestants just tend to list down a bunch of interests. What that does is, let's say a common paperwork example would look like, I like to cook, read, sing, dance, watch movies, and just like very, very generic. Now, here's the reality. The truth is, no judge is going to ask you questions when they read a sentence like that. What you want to do instead, if you want to talk about your interest, perhaps your interest somehow connects the dots to your platform or something really important in your life story that you do want to talk about. In that case, if you're going to write, say, cooking, I want to know what kind of cuisine do you like to cook. Maybe the interest will not be cooking. The interest will be, I make really good blank, whatever that dish name is. And that's a way of showing perhaps your culture. Maybe you've learned this dish, right? Let's say if I said, I make really good pasta, okay? And maybe I'm even specifying the name, like Alfredo pasta. I make the best Alfredo pasta. That can be inside my interests. And when the judge asks me, like, okay, how do you know it's one of the best, right? Or something along those lines, like it's just a conversation starter. You can then perhaps, maybe there's a story, you went to Italy and you took a cooking class there, and that's a whole story that you couldn't have possibly fit inside your paperwork. But now, because you mentioned it in a way that was a conversation starter, now the interview goes in that direction. And that's really all you want from your paperwork. You want it to have pieces of the three main points that you want to be the focus areas of your interview conversation. And you need to have that as the beginning of the thought process before you start filling out your paperwork. I recently posted a video where I said that if I was to ask a contestant one single question, if I was working with her to prepare her for a national pageant, the question I would ask her would be, what do you want people to remember about you? Think about that question, and if you can come up with 3 things that you want people to remember about you, or in this case, 3 things that you want the judges to know about you and to talk to you about further inside the interview, those 3 things are going to be guaranteed sprinkled into your paperwork in different ways, so that even if they talk about one of the points, you can always connect the story to the second one or the third one, and they're all interconnected because they're all a part of your life. The 4th mistake that I've seen contestants make, and not a lot of people realize, that this is not so much about the content, but about the way it was written, in what tone it was written inside the paperwork. What you want to ensure is that your paperwork is written in a conversational format and not so much of here's a data dump. You don't want it to only have bullet points. You can use them in places where it's intentional formatting so that the readability is easier. But when someone's reading your paperwork, I don't want it to sound dull and boring. And it definitely shouldn't look like an essay. In fact, when you want your paperwork to also reflect your personality, you can write it as if you were journaling, and the person reading it would read it in your voice, as if this is the way you talk. That's how you should write your paperwork. And that's something that definitely gives you an edge, because they feel like they have this connection and they know your thought process. Like reading your paperwork, I should be able to tell if she's an extroverted, funny, bubbly girl, or if she's more of a calm and poised girl. And if I can't tell that from your paperwork, the conversation tone is something that you can work on, because the voice of your paperwork and your voice and personality also do need to match. Because sometimes the application forms sound really confident and extroverted, but when you meet the person, they're not at all that. And here's the thing, you don't need to be an extrovert to win a pageant. And so just make sure that those 2 things are the same. And another thing that a conversational tone in paperwork helps you avoid is it avoids having one-dimensional paperwork. I remember working with a client for Miss Massachusetts USA recently, and when we started working together, her paperwork, because she was working in the corporate industry, she was so used to being in the tech corporate space that it was hard for her to have more of a conversational tone. And sometimes people tend to, because they've introduced themselves to people in the same industry of themselves, they end up mentioning their designation a lot. They keep repeating the same things about themselves because they're only used to talking about their work life. And that's what happened with her paperwork. We had to take her away from not just talking about yourself as a working professional, but overall as a human being. And when you look at your paperwork and see if it's conversational, you end up giving all aspects of your personality. And the last mistake I wouldn't want any contestant to make on their paperwork is to try and beef it up with buzzwords and futuristic planning and language. Because here's what happens. If you're talking about topics that you're not really confident about, but you just put that in there because you wanted your paperwork to sound impressive, as soon as an interview judge asks you a question and tries to go in depth in that conversation, they're going to be able to sniff out if there's a knowledge or experience gap here, or if she really intentionally wrote that on her paperwork. So don't try to bluff or beef up your paperwork and mention things that you wouldn't be comfortable talking about. Stick to your 3 main key strategy points like I mentioned, and you should be good to go. It's not about being someone or sounding someone that you're not. It's about just personalizing and telling stories about the experiences that you've had when it comes to your paperwork. You also don't want to use too much futuristic language. So phrases that will say that I will or I plan to, unless the question specifically asks, where do you see yourself in 5 years, or what is a goal that you're working on, or what are you most excited about towards the end of this year, things like that. Of course, they're asking you about the future. But other than that, if they've asked you, why do you want to be so-and-so title holder, you want to refrain from phrases that have I will and I plan to and I hope to. Oh my God, I hate that one. The reason being, here's the thing, the judges don't really want to know all the plans you can make because, I mean, come on, that's not realistic. You haven't really done any of that. What I want you to stick to is the actual impact that you're making. Tell me what you've already done. Tell me what you're currently doing. Anybody could talk about all the plans that they have, but that's all that is. They're just plans. And so those are the 5 mistakes that I see pageant contestants make most often when it comes to their paperwork. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode. And if you want to work with me further for your upcoming pageant, you are going to love my upcoming program, the Conquer Interview System, because while you're doing so many things in a pageant, it's important that not just do you do your preparation right, you also do things together. And if you're an ambitious woman who wants to save her time, not try year after year and try and learn things from experience, and you want to have cohesive preparation that aligns with who you are, doesn't feel like you're putting on an act just to win a pageant, this program is for you. Check out the link in the description box and join the waitlist for my upcoming program, and I'll be emailing you the details as well as some exclusive early access perks. I love you so much, and I'm going to see you in the next episode. Bye.